Details at CapitalOne.com.
Support for WNYC comes from National Geographic documentary films presenting The Mission, the story of John Chow, the American missionary killed attempting contact with the indigenous peoples of North Sentinel Island. Awards eligible, now streaming on Hulu and Disney+.
I'm Negin Farsad in for Peter Sagal. On last week's Wait, Don't Tell Me, we asked Dakota Johnson what it was like growing up with famous parents.
Well, I would tell you different things that I tell my therapist.
Okay.
This week, we'll ask our guest Fred Schneider of the B-52s to spill his innermost secrets. That and more on the News Quiz from NPR.
Tomorrow morning at 11 on 93.9 FM and AM 820 WNYC. The Marketplace Morning Report is coming up next, and then in 10 minutes at 9 o'clock, it's the BBC News Hour. Let's check in with London to see what they're working on. Good morning, BBC.
Good morning, WNYC. I'm James Menendez. Today on NewsHour, the Biden administration issues its strongest criticism yet of Israel's military operation in Gaza. Is Washington's tolerance for high numbers of civilian casualties now wearing out? Also, the Venezuelan government tells us why it wants to annex most of neighbouring Guyana. That's BBC NewsHour at 9 on WNYC.
Alternate side parking rules suspended today for the Immaculate Conception. Parking meters, however, still in effect. The EPA says the air quality is moderate due to particle pollution, but it's expected to be back at the good level later in the day. 41 degrees, mostly cloudy, a high of 48 this afternoon. Tonight, partly cloudy with a low of 42.
There's news hiring was slightly stronger than expected in the month gone by, and the unemployment rate has fallen.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by the United States Postal Service, offering holiday postage stamps for purchase at more than 40,000 supermarkets, drugstores, office suppliers, and wholesale clubs.
I'm David Brancaccio in New York. There's news that just under 200,000 more people were on payrolls in November. That is higher than expected, even when accounting for auto workers returning after the strike. The unemployment rate moved in the right direction, falling from 3.9 to 3.7% now. For more, let's check in with economist Julia Coronado. She's founder and president of Macro Policy Perspectives. Julia, from the perspective of people looking for work, how do you read this?
Well, this is a great report for people looking for work. There's lots of jobs still available. People actually kept returning to the labor force looking for work, and wage growth was relatively firm. So still a solid labor market.
Where were the gains? Who was getting jobs?
The gains are pretty concentrated in healthcare and education, state and local governments, leisure and hospitality. Manufacturing saw a big gain, but part of that was returning strikers. Absent that, it probably would have seen small job losses. So not as broad-based as earlier in the year, but still healthy numbers.
All right, so yay for real people. But if you're dying for interest rates to start falling soon, does this strength delay that a little bit?
It does. Markets had moved towards hoping or pricing a rate cut as early as the first quarter of the year. This probably pushes it back towards closer to the middle of the year before the Fed is confident enough to cut interest rates.
Thanks so much, Julia. Economist Julia Coronado is also a professor at the University of Texas, Austin. Again, the strength here could delay any lowering of interest rates in the new year, but moves in the market this morning are not wild in reaction. The 10-year interest rate is up slightly, 4.22%. Dow and S&P futures are both down about 0.2%.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by Charles Schwab. Schwab believes every investor deserves to work with a firm they can count on. That's why Schwab has financial consultants ready to serve their clients, plus professional answers and 24/7 live help. Learn more at schwab.com. And by C3 Generative AI, verified traceable answers, secure, hallucination-free, LLM-agnostic, IP liability-free. Learn more at c3.ai. And by This Is Uncomfortable, hosted by Rima Crace from Marketplace. Listen as we talk about life and how money messes with it. Listen to the new mini-season now.
This month for our Econ Extra Credit project, we're learning about inequality, insider trading, and cornering markets from not a documentary, but a holiday comedy from 1993. It's Trading Places with Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd, in which two tycoons make a bet about what happens if you take away the privilege of an entitled twit versus what happens if you give those privileges to a street hustler. The movie makes the point that wealth can turn people into jerks. There is real-world research on that point. Paul Piff is a professor of psychological science at the University of California, Irvine. Professor, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me on. Great to be here.
You and I here have talked before about your famous rigged Monopoly game study that you have tested far and wide. Game of Monopoly, contestants know the game is completely rigged in favor of one of them after a coin flip, but the winners think it's not the coin flip, but their own awesomeness that leads to success in the game. But lesser known is this other thing that you've done. It was your analysis of cars endangering pedestrians. How did you set that up?
We just were interested in whether drivers of different kinds of cars, drivers from different kinds of wealth backgrounds, would behave differently in terms of abiding by California Vehicle Code. Are they more or less likely to break the law? One of the versions of those studies, we actually posed a pedestrian at a crosswalk and secretly monitored whether drivers would stop for that pedestrian. What we found is that as the expensiveness of the car that you drove increased, the less likely you were to stop for the pedestrian. So the more likely you were to break the law.
What conclusions do you reach from seeing that data?
Yes, I think it's hard to draw clear conclusions from any single study. But at this point, we've got dozens of different studies looking at different facets of behavior that tell us that the more wealth you have, the less attentive to other people you become. And so what I think we're measuring in that car study may simply just be that if you come from greater means, if you have more wealth, you're just a little more focused on your own goals and interests, your own needs, what you yourself want to do, and you're a little less attentive to other people around you.
I mean, but this is an important point that you're making, which is that this one study grabbed our attention, but it fits into a matrix of other data suggesting similar conclusions.
It'd be one thing to make these kinds of general ascriptions that wealthy people are just like that. And after all, you have to be a person who has those kinds of values to become wealthy in the first place, right? You could make that argument that it's self-interested people that become wealthy and accrue wealth in the first place. But we've run experiments in the lab where we actually, like the Trading Places experiment, we actually bring rich and poor people into the lab and manipulate them into feeling like they're somewhat wealthier or somewhat less well off than someone else. And even that very temporary, fleeting experience of relative advantage or relative disadvantage makes people actually shift in their social values and shift in the kinds of behaviors they exhibit toward other people, making even poor people feel temporarily richer, temporarily more advantaged than someone else, actually shifts them into more greedy patterns of behavior.
Paul Piff, professor of psychological science, University of California, Irvine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
We'll also discuss the problem of addressing inequality when people tend to downplay the role of luck in their success. That's clickable on the Marketplace homepage. And you're invited to our Econ Extra Credit newsletter full of, we hope, teachable moments drawn from movies. Sign up free at marketplace.org/newsletters. Also note that Trading Places is not for everyone. What you may have seen on TV in the old days may not have had the offensive language and nudity that are in the uncut versions that stream now. Our executive producer is Kelly Silvera. Our digital producer is Dylan Mietinen. Our engineers are Jessen Duhler and Brian Allison. In New York, I'm David Brancaccio. It's Marketplace Morning Report. From APM, American Public Media.
WNYC is supported by the New York Phil, presenting holiday traditions throughout December, like Handel's Messiah and Holiday Brass, plus Marvel Studios' Black Panther in Concert, an event combining film and orchestra. Tickets at nyphil.org/holidays.
This is WNYC New York. I'm David First. The BBC NewsHour is next, and stay tuned for the Brian Lair Show at 10 o'clock this morning. Today on the show, former New York City Traffic Commissioner Gridlock Sam Schwartz shares his take on the city's congestion pricing plan. The EPA says the air quality is moderate due to particle pollution. It's actually expected to stay that way today in the moderate range. Right now, it's 41 degrees, going up to a high of 48 degrees with partly sunny skies. It's 9 o'clock.
This is WNYC, FM, HD, and AM, New York.
Welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. Hello, I'm James Menendez. The row over anti-Semitism on American university campuses. We'll talk to the Harvard rabbi who's resigned following a highly controversial appearance by the college's president before a congressional committee this week.
The Jewish community was constantly saying to me, we see you're on this panel. We see nothing is happening. Is that because you don't care you're doing nothing? You should not take a job that has accountability but no authority.
Also today, President Putin surprises no one by announcing he'll run for a fifth term in office.
Now is the right time, the time when a decision needs to be made. I will run for the position of President of the Russian Federation.
And the lack of investment hampering Africa's green transition. And crowds of Dubliners turn out for the funeral procession of the Pogues frontman Shane MacGowan. All that and more after the news.
Hello, this is Julie Candler with the BBC News. Vladimir Putin has said he will stand for re-election as Russian president when his term ends next spring. Speaking at a military awards ceremony, Mr. Putin said there was no other way.
I will not hide that I've had different thoughts at different times, but it is now time to make a decision. I will run for the position of President of the Russian Federation.
Mr. Putin is widely expected to be the only candidate with any chance of winning. Voting will take place between March the 15th and 17th. Israel has defended the treatment of dozens of detained Palestinian men by Israeli forces in northern Gaza. One of those detained was identified as a Palestinian newspaper journalist. From Jerusalem, here's our Middle East correspondent Yolande Nell.
On social media, there's been Palestinian outrage over footage showing blindfolded men and boys partly clothed while kneeling by Israeli soldiers on a street in northern Gaza. An Israeli government spokesman has now told the BBC that all of those arrested were of military age and found in areas which civilians were supposed to have evacuated weeks ago. Some detainees are said to have been released. 2 months into the war, the brutal fighting in Gaza continues to trigger international alarm. While the US is expected to block the latest attempt to pass a UN Security Council resolution calling for a humanitarian ceasefire, pressure on Israel is growing.
The US Embassy in Baghdad has been attacked by more than a dozen rockets, though no injuries have been reported. An embassy spokesman said a militia group aligned with Iran is believed to have been behind the incident. About 250 South Sudanese soldiers have left the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo, days after Kenyan soldiers started withdrawing. Our Africa regional editor Will Ross reports.
The South Sudanese troops left by plane from the city of Goma on the very day that a mandate expires for the East African military force that was meant to help pacify eastern Congo. President Felix Tshisekedi didn't want the East African troops to stay and so refused to extend their mandate. At the root of all this is how to end a conflict with the M23 rebels. Regional leaders wanted negotiations. Mr. Tshisekedi is favouring the military route. With elections due later this month, he needs votes in the east of the country, and that's probably why he's taking a tough stance against the dozens of armed groups there. But nearly 20 years of fighting them has failed to pacify eastern Congo.
North Korea is thought to have reopened 30 factories at an industrial park that was built by South Korea and is supposed to be closed. Seoul said Pyongyang had resumed using facilities at the Gaesung industrial complex, built on the northern side of the border 2 decades ago. South Korea has asked the North to close them again. World News from the BBC.
And this is WNYC in New York. I'm David First, 41 degrees, 4 minutes after 9 o'clock. New York City officials are calling for an investigation into a claim that the outgoing city jails boss tried to cover up violence on Rikers Island and retaliated against an employee who spoke up. WNYC's Jesse Edwards reports.
An investigator who has worked for the Department of Correction for almost 2 decades is now filing a claim against the city. He says jails boss Luis Molina and his appointees covered up problems and then retaliated against him when he spoke up. Ruben Benitez was an associate commissioner. He says after he reported the misconduct, Molina demoted him to an entry-level job with a $40,000 pay cut. Now, 2 city council members are calling for an investigation into the allegations. Molina is soon set to leave the jails department for a promotion at City Hall. City Hall would not comment on the pending litigation, but said Molina had the authority to make staff changes.
2 major food delivery companies are changing how they ask customers to tip delivery workers in the wake of boosts to those workers' wages. DoorDash and Uber Eats are both removing the prompt asking customers to tip before checkout. DoorDash says the move will help it, quote, balance the impact of bad policies, unquote, in the city. Both companies say customers will still be able to tip after the delivery is complete. Food delivery workers in New York City now must make at least $18 an hour. The pay bump went into effect earlier this week. Metropolitan Ave-bound M and southbound F trains running with delays. Southbound 1 trains are suspended after Rector Street. New Jersey Transit's Morrison-Essex line trains running on a modified schedule in both directions because of wire repairs. 41 degrees now, going up to 48 today with partly sunny skies. Tomorrow it's going to be mostly cloudy with a high of 52.
Hello and welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. We're coming to you live from London. I'm James Menendez. And we're going to begin today in the United States and the growing fallout from what can only be described as a disastrous set of appearances before a congressional committee by the heads of 3 of America's most august academic institutions. The presidents of Harvard, MIT and Pennsylvania University were all called to appear before the House Committee on Education on Tuesday to answer questions about how they were dealing with anti-Semitism on their campuses, especially in light of the war in the Middle East. Their failure to answer directly questions about whether they would discipline students calling for the genocide of Jews has been roundly condemned, including by the White House and one major donor to the University of Pennsylvania who's withdrawn a $100 million grant in protest at its president's testimony. And now a rabbi who sits on Harvard's anti-Semitism advisory committee has resigned. We'll hear from him in a moment. But first, a flavour of those exchanges in Congress. Here's the New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik questioning Harvard's president, Claudine Gay.
At Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment, yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
What's the context?
Targeted at an individual.
It's targeted at Jews.